David Taub here, co-founder of NextLevelGuitar.com. How you doing today? Hope all is well. Today I have a lesson for you on output tubes for tube amplifiers and the different types that are out there today and how they affect tone and why and what you want to look for when you're searching for an amp and a certain tone. It's important to know, the different types of tubes available and what tubes are in what given amps. We're talking about the bigger tubes today, the power tubes, as opposed to the smaller preamp tubes. I like calling them output tubes. You might have also heard them called power tubes. The output tubes are really responsible for creating, your amp's output, as opposed to ramping up the guitar signal, and that's kind of what the preamp tubes do, basically. There's more function than that, but basically, that's what we're talking about. You just don't want to get the, output tube mixed up with the rectifier tube, which is the third type of tube that you might find in your tube amp. To avoid confusion, I think it's good calling them output tubes. Now, in the old days, with all those, the tubes going into all that different type of equipment I was mentioning, there was a wide variety of different tubes that you might find. But today, really, for output tubes, there's basically 6 types that are the most common. And out of these 6, basically the first 4 you're going to find in about 95% of the amps on the market today, if not higher. So let's spend a little time going over each one of them and what makes them unique and what types of amps you will find them in. And again, if you're looking for an amp or you like a certain, wow, I like that Marshall tone, but maybe I want different features, but I want that basic sound, maybe, then you want to look at, well, what kind of output tubes does the Marshall I like have in it, and maybe check out some other amps that also carry those type tubes. Amps are designed with specific tubes in mind. So who's ever designing the amp, whatever manufacturer, designer, or builder, has a certain tone in mind, has a certain knowing the qualities of that tube. The amp is designed around that, around the sound or the tones or the characteristics of these output tubes, power tubes, preamp tubes. So the amps are designed with that specific tube in mind. And most amps today, you just can't pop one tube out and pop a different one in. Now, there are a few amps out there that you could do that they're actually made so you could swap tubes and try different tubes, but not all amps are like that. In most instances, you either can't do that or an amp will have to be heavily modified to do that. So just don't take the tubes out and throw another tube in, because it's a good way you can ruin your amplifier or cause some serious damage to it, unless the amp is specifically designed where you can try it with different tubes. The 6L6s are traditionally used in amps made in the United States. Think like big Fender amp tone. And that's kind of where it started, right? High power amps, very powerful tube in loud, clean amps, very bold voice, chimey, clean sounds, a crystal kind of highs, firm lows, and overall a really nice sound. Some of the amps that use 6L6s today would be like the Mesa Boogie Lone Star, the Mark V, that's the new one from Mesa Boogie, where they kind of combine like the Mark 1, 2, 3, and 4 and put everything into one amp they call now the Mark V. But that amp has 6L6s and it also has EL34s in it. Some amps that are very sophisticated, they can put different types of output tubes and run them for different sounds. The rectifier series by Mesa Boogie also uses the 6L6s, and some of the rectifiers also use the EL34s. For Fender, some of the amps by Fender, today's amps that use the 6L6s would be like the Hot Rod Deluxe, Hot Rod DeVilles, Blues DeVilles, the Bassman, the Twin, Super Reverb, Twin Reverb, all using these 6L6s. Amps by the manufacturer Crate, Peavey, and even the early Marshall JTM 45 heads use the 6L6s, although Marshalls are really known for the EL34s, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the EL34 tubes. But the 6V6 tube, it's different than the 6L6, mainly in the output. Think of this, you'd find in a lot of the amps made in the United States, the smaller amps, the less powerful amps, like the Tweed amps, USA made in like the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. A very well-rounded type of sound, applicable to a lot of blues guitar players really like the sound of these amps. A smooth, rich distortion, and it produces about half the amount of power, the amount of output of the 6L6s. So it's easier to push those tubes to distort because they're not putting out as much power. And this is a very critical feature. Let's say if you want an amp, a tube amp that you want to rehearse or practice maybe in your bedroom with, but you want that smooth, rich distortion, you might not want to get a big amp with the 6L6s because that has so much power. It would be you have to crank that up really loud to get those tubes to distort, to get that real rich, distorted sound. Whereas the 6V6 is a much less power, so you don't have to push them as much to get the tubes to distort, right? So again, know your application. What do I need this amp for? Do I need it to play in my bedroom? Do I need it for rehearsals? Do I need it to play in small, mid-sized clubs? Application is so critical to kind of point you in a direction of what amp, and then start looking at, well, what kind of sound do I want? What kind of features do I want in an amp? What kind of tone? And you can look to some of the tubes to help you with that. The blues players really like these amps because, again, they can get that rich distortion and not blow everybody off the stage and whatnot. Like the Fender Deluxe Reverb has these 6V6s in them. Cool tube, check it out. And these top four are not in order, like 6L6 is number 1, number 2. It's just these four you'll find in 95% of the amps today. The EL34s. And this is your typical British crunch kind of sound. Your traditional Marshall type sound is going to be used. The EL34 is fat, softer, low end, classic kind of crispy, crunchy, right? Stingy, a more pronounced distortion in like the 6550 tubes the EL34s are. Very, very, very trademark sound out of the EL34s, and many amp manufacturers use them in their amps and applications because it's such a popular tube. Post 67 Marshalls, that was the tube of choice. The JMP50, the Plexi, the metal panel amps from Marshall, like the JCM 800, most of those all EL34s. Amps by Matchless use them. Badcat, Orange, High Watt, Trainer, Laney, a lot of the British type manufacturers. And not to say that Badcat only makes amps with EL34s, because they use other tubes. And a lot of amp manufacturers might use different type tubes for different amps in their line. But, most manufacturers, many of them do consider using the EL34s. You'll find them in all kinds of amps, but that have that, you need that real kind of rocked out British crunch. You'll have it in the EL34. EL84s. Now the EL84 is another classic British type tube, and it doesn't look as big as the 6L6 or the 6V6. They're about the size of the preamp tube diameter wise, but they're taller. So that's how you can always know the EL34s. They're kind of skinny and narrow and tall as opposed to your traditional type of output tube. Distinctive, articulate, chimey, sparkling highs. Kind of like a glassy brightness to them. Real chunky and aggressive when pushed. And a lot of the EL84s you'll find in the classic Vox amps. The AC15, AC30, your Fender Blues Junior. PV Classic today uses the EL84s. Badcat and Crate use EL84s in some of their amp line. The Mesa Boogie Lone Star Special uses the EL84s. The Lone Star uses the 6L6s, like I was saying earlier, but the Lone Star Special uses the EL84s, and that's what I was talking about when I was saying earlier how amp manufacturers can try different types of output tubes in their various different amp lines. Also, the Mesa Boogie Express uses the EL84s, so a popular choice of tube. And you probably say, well, a lot of these characteristics sound kind of similar on the clean end than the 6L6s. And they do sound similar, but, it's different. Like a clean Fender Hot Rod DeVille or a clean Fender DeVille sounds very different than a clean channel sound or a clean tone on an AC30. Listen to them both and you'll see exactly what I'm saying. The Fender, to me, is a little bit rounder, maybe not as bright, but it's similar but different. because of the characteristics of these tubes. And a lot of it just falls down to personal preference, you know, what you like best, what sounds best to your ears, right? And also remember, though, that different manufacturers of the same tube, those tubes can sound a little bit different. Like an output tube made by a Russian company, a 6L6, might sound a little different than a 6L6 made by a company in China or in Eastern Europe. So, you know, really do your homework and really know what you're looking for to kind of funnel your search down, like I always say, and study online. There's a wealth of information, all right? I'm David Taub, co-founder of NextLevelGuitar.com, and keep on rocking.